I object. Orion's voice echoed through the courtroom, drawing all eyes to him. Judge Sophia Reynolds looked up, a hint of disbelief flashing in her eyes. She slowly put down the verdict in her hand and narrowed her eyes to stare at Orion. Mr. Orion, do you realize that you are in contempt of court? Judge Reynolds' voice was cold as ice. Orion shrugged with a disinterested expression. I'm just stating the facts, Your Honor. This trial has been a farce from the start. The courtroom erupted in an uproar. Orion's ex-wife, Sarah, covered her mouth, shock and anger in her eyes. Her attorney immediately stood up, ready to protest. But Orion had no intention of stopping. Since you seem to have trouble with the word objection, perhaps I should use a simpler word? How about no, for example? Or do you not even understand that? Judge Reynolds' face turned red as she pounded her gavel. Mr. Orion, I'm warning you. One more word and I'll have you thrown in jail for contempt of court. Orion sneered. Then you better call the guards now, because I have a lot to say. Just 6 years ago, Orion and Sarah were the envy of all. They met in college, where Sarah was a senior at the School of Economics, and Sarah's family was recognized as a powerful and influential family in Silicon Valley, while Orion was a genius in the computer science department. After graduation, the two teamed up to start a technology company specializing in financial technology. Their wedding was held on the day of the company's IPO, and they were a perfect match. Sarah in a white dress, Orion in a suit, and the two of them made their vows with the blessing of the crowd. In good times and bad, for richer or poorer, I will always love and honor you until death do us part, Orion said firmly as he looked deep into Sarah's eyes. With tears in her eyes, Sarah responded softly, Me too, my love. At the time, Orion could never have imagined that just a few short years later, they would meet in court. In the second year of their marriage, Sarah became pregnant. At first, they thought it was just a baby. But at the first ultrasound, the doctor told them the shocking news. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Sarah. You're going to have triplets. Orion nearly faints in the examining room, and Sarah squeals with excitement. 3? Are you sure, doctor? Orion stammered. The doctor smiled and pointed to the screen. Look, here, here, and here. 3 little lives, all healthy. From that day on, Orion and Sarah's lives changed forever. They bought a bigger house, got a trio of baby supplies. Sarah had to go on early maternity leave, and Orion had to work both at the office and at home. The day the triplets were born, Orion stood outside the delivery room, listening to the cries coming from inside, and felt like his life had been completely different. As their children grew up, Orion and Sarah's careers flourished. Their company is unique in the fintech space. With a rising market capitalization, Orion has become one of Silicon Valley's most sought-after tech elites, and Sarah has been hailed as one of Wall Street's most promising female executives. However, success often comes with a price, as Orion began traveling frequently for meetings and receptions, and Sarah had to balance taking care of her 3 children and managing the company. Conflicts began to creep in. Orion, can you spend more time with the kids? Sarah said late one night, looking at Orion, who had just returned from the airport. Orion rubbed his temples wearily. Honey, you know I want to, but this is a critical time for the company and I can't afford to relax. Sarah sighed. I know, but kids need a father, not just someone who provides material things. Orion didn't answer, just walked into the study in silence. Things take a turn for the worse on a normal Tuesday night when Orion comes home early to surprise Sarah. However, just before he pushes open the door to his home, he sees a life-changing scene through the window and his world comes crashing down. Sarah was snuggling intimately with a man on the couch. The man, Orion recognized. It was the CFO of their company, Jack. Orion didn't rush, didn't yell. He retreated quietly, the anger and sadness in his heart nearly consuming him. From that day on, Orion began a covert investigation. He hired private investigators, installed hidden cameras, and even hacked into Sarah's cell phone and computer. The evidence piled up like snowflakes. Text messages, emails, hotel records, bank transfers. Sarah and Jack's affair has been going on for almost a year. What breaks Orion's heart even more is the realization that 2 of the triplets, may not be his children at all. And while that may be medically rare, it's not impossible. One sunny morning, while Sarah was still asleep, Orion quietly took the children's hair and sent it off for a paternity test. The day the paternity test results came back, Orion sat in his office, staring at the report, tears streaming down his face uncontrollably. His world, his family, everything he had, completely fell apart at that moment. Orion didn't show his hand right away. He continued to play the role of the perfect husband and father, as he always did. But secretly, he began thorough preparations. First, he contacted a reputable divorce attorney, David, nicknamed the Devil's Lawyer, in Silicon Valley's wealthy circles because of his ability to get the most favorable terms for his clients. "Are you sure you want to do this, Orion?" asked David from his plush office. "Once you start, there's no turning back." Orion's eyes were firm. "I've never been more certain." Over the next several months, Orion began secretly transferring assets. He set up a number of offshore companies and transferred most of his shares and cash into the names of these companies. At the same time, he also began to secretly weaken Sarah's influence within the company. At home, Orion acts more considerate than ever. He often takes Sarah and the children on vacations and buys Sarah expensive gifts, and Sarah seems to sense what's going on and becomes more gentle and considerate. Sometimes Orion looks at Sarah and the children's happy smiles and gets a twinge inside. But whenever he remembers the evidence, his heart grows cold again. 6 months later, Orion felt the time was right. He chose to do it at the company's annual shareholders meeting. Orion stood up while Sarah was giving her speech on stage. "Shareholders, I have an important announcement to make." His voice overpowered Sarah's. Everyone turned their heads to look at him. Sarah looked at Orion in confusion. "What's wrong, dear?" Orion looked at her coldly. "Sarah, in my capacity as the company's majority shareholder, I propose to immediately remove you from all positions. At the same time," he paused, "I am filing for a divorce from you." The whole conference hall instantly fell into a dead silence. Sarah's face was so white that she almost fainted on the stage. Just then, an attorney representing Orion walked into the conference room and presented Sarah with divorce papers on the spot. At the first session, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Sarah's attorney was aggressive. "Your Honor, my client contributed greatly to the growth of the company during the marriage. She deserves half of the company." Orion's lawyer David sneered. "Contribution? If you're referring to Ms. Sarah's inappropriate relationship with Jack, the company's CFO, that would indeed be a great contribution." Sarah snapped to her feet. "You're bullshitting me." David unhurriedly pulled out a stack of papers. "Your Honor, here are Sarah's texts and emails to and from Mr. Jack Williams, as well as," he paused, "hotel rooming records." The courtroom was once again in an uproar. Sarah slumped in her chair, tears coming to her eyes. Just then Orion stood up. "One more thing," his voice trembled a little. "I have evidence to believe that 2 of our 3 children are not my biological children." This bombshell shocked the entire courtroom. The judge had to bang his gavel to maintain order. The judge recommended mediation between the parties, but the mediation quickly stalled. Sarah insists on half of the company and custody of the children, and Orion refuses to budge, demanding that the results of the paternity test be announced in the first place and refusing to give Sarah any shares. That's when Sarah's family steps in. Sarah's family is a big name in Silicon Valley, and Sarah's father, a man of high standing in Silicon Valley, personally approaches Orion. "Orion, you have to realize that this lawsuit is not going to do anyone any good." Sarah's father pretended to be serious and said, "For the sake of the children, we should talk. But I know it's all just for the sake of Sarah's family's reputation." Orion looked coldly at the man who had once been like a father to him. "You're right. We really should talk. For example, since when did you know that your daughter was cheating on me?" Sarah's father's face changed. "What do you mean by that?" Orion pulled out a file. "This is a log of Sarah and Jack's text messages. Several of them mention you. It appears that you are not only aware of it, but you are condoning it." Sarah's father was silent for a long time and said grimly, "Orion, you can't win. The influence of our Sarah's family in Silicon Valley, you know it well. Otherwise, you will regret it." Orion stood up and said calmly, "Then let's see what happens." On the day of the final trial, The eyes of all of Silicon Valley were on this courtroom. Sarah's attorney cited her contributions to the company and asked for half of the shares and primary custody, while Orion's attorney presented evidence of Sarah's marital infidelity and asked the court to dismiss her claims. Just as the judge was about to announce his verdict, Orion suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, before you pass sentence, I have a request." Judge Sophia Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead, Mr. Orion." Orion took a deep breath. "I demand that the results of the paternity test be read in court." The whole courtroom was once again in an uproar. Sarah lost her voice and cried, while her lawyer protested strongly. But the judge, after much consideration, finally granted Orion's request. The moment the results came out, everyone held their breath. According to the DNA match, only one of the 3 children is Mr. Orion's biological child. The outcome changed the situation completely. Judge Reynolds ultimately made a surprising decision. Orion was awarded custody of his only biological child, and Sarah lost all interest in the company. The moment the gavel fell, Orion felt an inexplicable emptiness. It was as if he had won, but at what cost? No sooner had the verdict dropped than Sarah screamed hysterically, "No, you can't do this to me, Orion, you bastard. I'm going to make you regret this." She stood up violently and grabbed the glass of water on the table and slammed it at Orion, who sidestepped it and it shattered against the wall. The courtroom erupts into chaos. Just as the security guard was about to subdue Sarah, Orion said coldly, "Looks like someone can't afford to lose." Sarah's eyes turned red instantly. "What did you say?" Orion shrugged. "I'd say you're not only a liar, you're a sore loser." Bang! Came the sound as Sarah slapped Orion across the face. Orion rubbed his face and suddenly smiled. "Nice shot, Moore." Sarah was about to strike again when Orion made the first move and grabbed her wrist. "You know what? I wish it was that little lover of yours, Jack, who was here right now. I'd give him a taste of what it's like to be betrayed." "Enough," Judge Reynolds roared. "Mr. Orion, you are in contempt of court. Security, take them both down." With that, Orion and Sarah were both placed in a holding cell. Orion was expecting only a short detention, not realizing that the judge only gave him 30 days in jail, and Sarah was released the same day. Prison life is a lot tougher than Orion thought it would be. As a white-collar elitist, he quickly becomes a target for bullying by the other inmates. Just as Orion is cornered by a couple of burly men, a voice suddenly rings out, "Hey guys, don't touch him." Orion looked up at a tall man with a bushy beard. "Who are you?" A burly man asked disdainfully. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that this guy is my guy. Understand?" The burly men looked at each other and walked away resentfully. "Thanks," Orion said. "I'm Orion." "My name's Mike," said the tall man. "And I know who you are, the big man in Silicon Valley." From that day on, Mike becomes Orion's protector in the prison, and Orion soon realizes that Mike is no ordinary prisoner. He seems to have a lot of influence in the prison, and even the guards treat him with respect. "What the hell are you?" Orion couldn't help but ask one day. Mike smiled mysteriously. "You'll probably know when you get out." While incarcerated, Orion was brought back to court several times. Each time, he had to deal with the aggressiveness of Sarah and her team of lawyers. "Mr. Orion, do you realize how much harm your actions have caused the children?" Sarah's attorney questioned. Orion calmly replied, "I think it's better for the kids to know the truth than to be lied to their entire lives." Judge Reynolds was clearly upset with Orion's attitude. "Mr. Orion, I hope you realize what you're in for. If you continue with this attitude, I don't mind extending your sentence." Orion looked at the judge and suddenly smiled. "Judge Reynolds, I have a question for you." "What's the problem?" "Have you also been betrayed by your husband? It seems to me that you are extra sensitive and special in your treatment of what happened to me." The courtroom was in an uproar. Judge Reynolds' face turned white for an instant. "Mr. Orion, one more word and I'll hold you in contempt for 6 months." Orion shrugged and stopped talking, but he knew that he had touched a sore spot with the judge. After 30 days, Orion was finally released. But what awaits him is not the glamorous life of old. His lawyer, David, met him at the prison gate. "It's not going well," David said. Sarah's legal team froze most of your assets while you were in there. Orion sneered. Can they find it? David shook his head. Not yet, but they're doing everything they can to track down your overseas assets. Also, he paused. The company's board of directors voted to remove you as CEO. Orion was silent for a moment. Looks like they all couldn't wait to kick me out. For the next few days, Orion lives in a small apartment, pretending to make a living as a technical consultant for small companies. He tries to see his children, but Sarah is always in the way for various reasons. One day, Orion bumps into Jack at the supermarket. Are you satisfied? Jack said grimly. You ruined Sarah and Sarah's family's reputation. Now I'm going to make you taste the pain of having nothing to lose as well. Orion stared at Jack and suddenly laughed. I ruined her life? That's funny. Tell me, Jack, do you really love her? Or is it just for the power and wealth behind Sarah's family? Jack froze and didn't answer. Orion continues, if you really loved her, you shouldn't have let her make mistakes. She was a wife with family responsibilities. But you didn't, because you're just a coward, a power-hungry and wealthy little man. With that said, Orion turned and left, leaving Jack standing alone with shock and shame written all over his face. Orion soon realizes that he is being watched. Wherever he goes, there are always a few sneaky figures. One night, he pretended to be drunk and deliberately stumbled around in the street. Sure enough, two men followed. Just as they're about to strike, Orion suddenly turns around and punches one of them in the face. The other man was about to pull out a gun, but was overpowered by Mike, who appeared out of nowhere. I knew you'd need help sooner or later, Mike said with a smile. Orion looked at the subdued pair and asked coldly, Who sent you? One of them shuddered. It's the Sarah family. They said to make sure you don't run away, to make you live and die for the loss of the Sarah family's reputation. Orion and Mike looked at each other, and both saw the determination in the other's eyes. Looks like, Orion said, it's time to fight back. Orion and Mike meet at an out-of-the-way tavern where there are no security cameras and no one will recognize them. So, what exactly are you? Orion asked, getting right to the point. Mike smiled. I used to be a special forces soldier, then became a private security guard. Now, only my special skills and connections can help. Orion nods. I need to disappear completely, not just hide, but erase my existence entirely. Mike's eyes lit up. Then you've got the right guy. But it's going to take a lot of money and sophisticated planning. Money isn't the problem, Orion said. I still have some reserves overseas. The key is how to transfer it without getting caught. They spend the entire evening formulating a plan. Mike has a friend who is a computer whiz and can help erase Orion's digital footprint. Another friend can provide high-quality fake identity documents. Remember, Mike said seriously, once you start, there's no turning back. Are you ready? Orion looks out the window at the city lights, remembers the betrayals and the hurt, and says firmly, I'm ready. Orion knows that Sarah's family and Sarah's team of lawyers are doing everything they can to track down his offshore assets. He needs a seamless plan to move the money. He contacted an old friend, now working for a Swiss bank. Through a series of complex operations, Orion spread the funds across multiple micro accounts around the world. Each transfer was disguised as a normal business transaction, and the amount was kept to an unobtrusive level. At the same time, he also intentionally left some obvious traces of funds to lead investigators astray. Orion even hired a couple of actors and had them show up at banks and real estate companies in different countries, pretending to be himself taking care of business. These fakes wear down those who track him, but always come up empty. Mike's friends did have a couple of tricks up their sleeves. Within a few short weeks, Orion had 3 complete sets of identity documents. Each set included a passport, driver's license, credit cards, and even a detailed backstory. This one is David Lee, a Canadian IT consultant, Mike introduced, and this one is Michael Wong, a Singaporean businessman. And this last one is Carlos Gonzalez, Argentine photographer. Orion scrutinized each document. Fantastic. It's almost as good as the real thing. Mike said seriously, remember to memorize the backstory for each identity. If asked, be able to answer any details fluently. Orion nodded and began to carefully learn the details of each identity. He even learned to speak in different accents so that he could quickly switch identities when needed. In order not to arouse suspicion, Orion decided to organize a fresh start party. He invited some old friends and former colleagues, including several board members. The party was set up in an interesting way. At the entrance was a huge model of a labyrinth, suggesting that Orion was looking for a way out of life. On the wall was a picture of a landscape from all over the world, which seemed to suggest Orion's longing for faraway places. Orion raises his glass and addresses the crowd. "Thank you all for coming to my rebirth party. The past is in the past, and now I'm starting over." He made a point of glancing at the man Sarah had sent to watch him and continued, "Some might think I'd run away, but I will say that Orion never runs away. I will prove my innocence in my own way." After the party, Orion makes sure he's seen returning to his apartment drunk. But no one knew that his bags were already packed and hidden in Mike's car. At 3 a.m., Orion quietly leaves the apartment and gets into Mike's car parked on the corner. "Ready?" Mike asked. Orion took a deep breath. "Let's go." They first drove to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. There, Orion changes into a David Lee costume and transfers to another car. Along the way, they go through 3 bought and paid for checkpoints. At each checkpoint, Orion passes under a different identity. "Excuse me, sir, your passport?" the policeman at the first checkpoint said. Orion flashes a friendly smile and says in a standard Canadian accent, "Sure, here you go. I'm an IT consultant here on business." The police officer scrutinized him and waved him through. At the second checkpoint, Orion becomes Michael Wong. The third is Carlos Gonzalez. Each time, he plays a different role perfectly. Finally, they arrived at the private airport. A small airplane was already waiting. Just as Orion was about to board the plane, sirens suddenly sounded in the distance. "Go," Mike said hastily. "I'll hold them off." Orion hesitated. "What about you?" Mike laughed. "Don't worry, I have a way to get out of this. Now, get on with your new life." Orion nods and quickly boards the plane. As the plane takes off, he sees Mike circling the arriving police. Orion breathed a long sigh of relief as the plane shot up into the clouds. He knew that his old life was over and a whole new one awaited him. Orion felt as if he had been reborn when the plane landed at the small airport in Bali. He took a deep breath of the tropical scented air, and the corners of his mouth involuntarily rose. "Welcome to paradise, sir." The driver who picked him up smiled. Orion is now David Lee, a Canadian IT consultant who came to Bali for inspiration. He rented a small villa facing the ocean and enjoys a gorgeous sunrise every morning. At first, Orion was a little uncomfortable. He would wake up in the middle of the night thinking he was still in his mansion in Silicon Valley. But gradually, he began to enjoy this simple and free life. He learned to surf and would go to the beach every evening to play volleyball with the locals. In the evenings, he would bang out code on his balcony and take on remote IT consulting jobs. Sometimes, locals would curiously ask about his past. Orion always smiled and said, "Let bygones be bygones. What matters is the present and the future." During his peaceful days in Bali, Orion often thinks back to the past. He thought back to the night he first found out Sarah was cheating on him. It seemed like yesterday that he was so angry and heartbroken. "Maybe I should just confront her about it," Orion muttered to himself. "But then I might not get to know the whole truth." He remembers Sarah's hysteria in the courtroom and the prejudiced look in Judge Reynolds' eyes. Does the law really bring justice? He couldn't help but ask himself. It was the unexpected help that made Orion feel most emotional. Mike's presence was like destiny. Without him, Orion might have been captured by Sarah's family long ago. "Even though Mike charged me a large fee, I still owe Mike a favor," Orion thought. "Maybe one day I can repay him." Away from the hustle and bustle of Silicon Valley, Orion has more time to think about life. Regarding marriage, he used to take love and fidelity for granted. Now he understands that sustaining a relationship takes a concerted effort and honesty on both sides. Maybe we were all too young and naive, Orion muses, to think that success would bring happiness. The legal system is a deep disappointment to Orion. The law is supposed to be the guardian of justice, he murmurs to the sea. but sometimes it becomes a cover for injustice instead. The complexity of human nature also strikes a chord with Orion, whose humanity is re-examined by Sarah's betrayal, the ruthlessness of Sarah's family, and even the help of strangers like Mike. People are complex, Orion concludes, and can't be defined simply in terms of good or bad. One day, Orion was browsing the news when a story caught his attention. Prominent Silicon Valley judge arrested for corruption and bribery. Orion fixes his eyes on Judge Sophia Reynolds. Reports say she's been taking bribes from certain large corporations for years to influence the outcome of the verdict. No wonder she's so biased in my case, Orion sneered. But the gloating was soon replaced by a mixture of emotions. Maybe she's a victim of life too, Orion thought, blinded by money and power. The news makes Orion reflect on his situation once again. Although he has now evaded the law, deep down, he knows he is not completely innocent. After living in Bali for 6 months, Orion began to think about his future. He had gotten used to life here, but deep down, he knew he couldn't hide forever. One day, he received an encrypted email. It was from Mike. "Everything's safe. Sarah's family has given up the trail. Sarah and Jack broke up. Your own children miss you. If you're ready, consider coming back." Orion stared at the screen for a long time. Going back? To face all that hurt and betrayal? Face his children? He walked to the beach and looked at the rough sea. Life is like this wave. It has ups and downs and never stops. Maybe it's time to face everything, Orion said to himself, not for revenge, but for reconciliation. For my children and for myself. He took a deep breath, pulled out his cell phone, and began to edit his reply. "Thanks, Mike. I think I'm ready. But there's one more thing I have to do before I go back." Orion looked at the distant horizon, a small smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. No matter what the future held, he knew he was no longer the same Orion who had been toyed with by fate. He has been reborn and is ready for a new start in life. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a story to share about your own or someone else's experience, please feel free to contact me. Take care.